and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara Seidler.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
Protests on the streets of LA have entered another day after the city's mayor announced a curfew and state of emergency yesterday. These protests began last Friday after the country's immigration enforcement body conducted a series of widespread raids. Since then, protesters have been gathering across the city to call for an end to the raids. In response to these protests, US President Donald Trump has deployed the National Guard and Marines, a decision that has been hotly contested by the state's governor. In today's podcast, we'll explain everything you need to know about how the situation got to this point and the latest for those in LA.
Zara, so many of us had a long weekend. This weekend just passed and might have missed the origins of this story. It felt like all of a sudden there were these really intense headlines coming out of LA, violent scenes, reports of injuries, an Australian journalist making headlines caught in the crossfire or directly fired at by police on the ground. It feels like things are escalating with every passing day. But for people who might just be tuning in, where does it all begin?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Em, because if you've seen the escalation and you don't know the source, it can be a bit confusing. So the story begins on Friday last week when Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they're called ICE, and I'll just call them that for ease for the rest of the podcast, they conducted a series of widespread raids on businesses across the city of Los Angeles. ICE is the federal agency responsible for enforcing immigration laws and deporting people who are in the US without legal permission. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are familiar with them. Now, ICE has been carrying out raids over the past few months as part of President Donald Trump's broader immigration crackdown. So this idea of raids is not a new thing. It's certainly been quite a feature of this term of the Trump presidency. Just last month, the Trump administration set a target to arrest 3,000 people a day over alleged immigration violations. It's a very, very big number.
That's enormous.
It is. And so I say that just to set the scene that while these raids are not unfamiliar to those watching the Trump presidency, the ones that occurred in LA on Friday were seen, at least by those protesters who gathered afterwards, to be substantially wider in scope than the previous ICE operations. So, for example, the Associated Press reported that people were arrested in a Home Depot parking lot, so a chain store, outside a chain store, as part of these raids. And LA's Mayor Karen Bass, who you're going to hear quite a lot about in this podcast, said in an interview, "How did we get from gang members to Home Depot?" She's referring there to the fact that originally these raids were targeting, or at least as the Trump administration said, they were targeting gang members, but it has become far more widespread than that. According to officials, more than 100 people were arrested on Friday alone in these immigration raids.
Okay, so the kind of protest response that we've seen is really in response to the scope of these raids rather than them existing in the first place. We've known for some time that Donald Trump is hardline on his immigration stance. He campaigned on it in the lead up to the November election. So this policy isn't necessarily surprising, but the number of raids that have been carried out is what is shocking people.
I think that it's all of those things taken together. I think you're right that people have seen this happen before, but as we said, the nature of these do feel different, and certainly the response that we've seen now happen in LA is far more significant than we've seen elsewhere in the country.
Yeah. So these raids started on Friday in LA, then the protesters start to gather in parts of the city. What happens from there?
It's a pretty quick turnaround between people first finding out about those raids and protesters starting to gather. And the original site of the protest is the Metropolitan Detention Center in LA. That's where some of the people who have been detained by ICE agents during those raids are being held. And so protesters start to arrive outside that center and begin to protest against ICE. Over the course of the weekend, the protests begin to grow in numbers. We've seen lots of pictures of demonstrators holding signs that read things like ICE out of LA and education, not deportation. I say that just to give you some sense of what it is these people are actually asking for and protesting against.
Yeah.
One protester told local news over the weekend that the whole thing about going after immigrants and people who are undocumented, the most vulnerable of our populations, that is so wrong. So that is kind of the flavour, I guess, of where these protesters are coming from.
The community response.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so these protests are originally described by police to be largely peaceful when they begin on Friday and then again into Saturday. However, by Sunday, police and protesters have begun clashing. The LA Police Department, the LAPD, said it made 28 arrests on Sunday after it says that protests escalated. It said that it responded to acts of violence, vandalism, and looting. And then the LAPD's chief, Jim McDonald, claimed in a press conference that the unrest had become increasingly worse and more violent. And that's certainly, I think, where we've started to see some of those images and videos coming out of LA.
Okay, so what was or has been the response to this escalation? Police have described peaceful action that has turned violent. We've seen more and more coverage. It appears the protests have grown in size.
Yeah.
What happens next?
So the next big part of this story, and it's kind of confusing because there are two big stories happening at once. There's what's happening on the ground in LA, and then there's also this political story that is unfolding at the same time. But basically, the next part of this story comes when US President Donald Trump signs an executive order deploying 2,000 National Guard members to LA.
Zara, forgive my potential ignorance here. When we say National Guard, they sound very important and official.
They are.
What is the National Guard?
The National Guard is a reserve military force. So it's typically made up of part-time soldiers who can hold civilian jobs and often do hold civilian jobs, but then they're called to active duty in specific circumstances.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So in a statement, Trump said, to the extent that protests or acts of violence directly inhibit the execution of the laws, they constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. And so that is the justification that Donald Trump has provided in a statement when he signed that executive order calling for the National Guard to be deployed. He was basically calling these protests a rebellion against the United States government.
And I guess that kind of answers the question that I had in my mind about how did we go from local police, the LAPD managing this response, at a state level there is a management, and then that escalating to a federal response.
Hey, I'm Harry. I'm the political journalist here at the Daily Aus. If you like this video, you can subscribe so that you don't miss any of our future ones, and you can see more of our great stuff. Now, back to the deep dive.
Well, your question, I think, is the question that Californian Governor Gavin Newsom also has. Because this is where there has been a lot of political tension.
Okay.
So just to set the scene, Gavin Newsom is a Democrat. He's the governor of California. He's largely seen as a potential next presidential candidate, but we'll put that aside for the sake of this discussion.
Before.
Exactly. So he has typically been quite an outspoken opponent of Donald Trump. And so where this has come to a head is that typically state governors control their state's National Guard, and they use them for emergencies like national disasters.
Okay.
So the president can activate them, but typically and historically, this occurs with the governor's consent.
Right.
And so Trump is actually the first president since 1965 to deploy the National Guard without a governor's request.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is where the kind of political fallout stems from. When it comes to why Donald Trump has done this without asking for or discussing with the governor of the state, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said, in the wake of this violence, California's feckless Democrat leaders have completely abdicated their responsibility to protect their citizens.
Okay, so a lot going on there. As you've described, the National Guard kind of historically has been used in apolitical senses to recover or respond to emergency threats, and that could be natural disasters. And typically we see presidents working with state governors to coordinate that response. But now we've had these really strong words from the White House condemning California's handling of
the situation.
And that's led us to this political division as well as this on-the-ground action. I can't imagine Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is particularly pleased with the sentiment coming out of the White House. Have we heard from him?
So he has actually made moves to sue Donald Trump. On the deployment of troops, he called Trump's move an unmistakable step towards authoritarianism, and he said that he had filed this lawsuit to end the illegal and unnecessary takeover of the National Guard, which has needlessly escalated chaos and violence in the LA region.
Wow.
So basically, he's saying, I'm filing this lawsuit for two reasons. One, Donald Trump deployed the National Guard without the consent or the input of me, the Californian governor, not me, Zara Seidler. And second, that the decision by Donald Trump, he claims, was unwarranted. That basically sending in the National Guard, all 3,000 of them, is escalating a situation that could have been handled by local authorities.
What's the goal of launching a proceeding like that? If Gavin Newsom successfully sues Trump, is it basically asking for an admission of wrongdoing?
Well, he's been trying to stop it from continuing.
Okay.
So he's tried to put a pause on allowing them in.
Got
But this all takes time, as we know.
So how has Donald Trump then responded?
Well, Trump's taken to social media to actually voice support for arresting Newsom.
Okay.
So over the weekend, Newsom, again, the Californian governor, he dared Tom Homan, who is the director of ICE, to arrest him. And then in response, Donald Trump saw those tweets and said, I would do it if I were Tom. So he's saying if he were in charge, he would arrest the governor. Fair to say that Newsom didn't take to that one too well. He said on social media, the president of the United States just called for the arrest of a sitting governor. This is a day I hoped I would never see in America. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. This is a line we cannot cross as a nation.
It's been so interesting, obviously, from our perspective as outsiders here in Australia, seeing this unfold, because I think part of Donald Trump's legacy has been his policy around state versus federal leadership. And I think he's been very clear on state responsibilities for certain aspects of healthcare and education. But now this is playing out in a very different way. So
yeah, well, I mean, just to bring it home for an Australian audience, this is kind of the equivalent of Anthony Albanese, a Labor Prime Minister, being sued by a Liberal Premier in, say, David Crisafulli, the Queensland Premier, and in turn calling for his arrest. That is the, I guess, equivalent, as much as we can do an equivalency.
When you put it like that, it seems pretty bizarre.
It is. It's certainly a really significant moment. But what's more than that, it's that this is all occurring as there is this state of emergency unfolding in LA.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you, what is happening on the ground in LA at the time of recording? What do we know about the situation right now?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it's not de-escalating by any stretch of the imagination, that protesters are still taking to the streets. They are still calling on ICE to stop their raids. We know, of course, that the National Guard has since arrived after being summoned by President Trump, as have Marines who were also ordered into the city. Now, the source of the protests, kind of finishing as we ended this podcast, so those immigration raids, they've actually also continued throughout this period. So it hasn't been like Friday was the end point and since then there have been none. They've continued throughout this period. CBS News, which is an American outlet, reports that they've seen figures that say that ICE recorded more than 1,200 arrests across the US over the weekend. In terms of on the ground in LA, yesterday LA's mayor announced a curfew and she declared a national state of emergency. She said that was to stop the vandalism and to stop the looting. So that will be in place, that curfew, from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. in parts of downtown LA. And we'll have to wait and see if that has any effect on the protests. But it does feel like this is only growing. The anger and the hostility, certainly on both sides, appears to be growing. And I think I'll just end off with what Donald Trump has said most recently. He said that LA was being invaded and conquered by a foreign army. He said that yesterday.
Wow. Very, very strong language there. But I think it's also interesting to touch on, downtown LA, we're talking about a densely populated area of a major global city. And this is a story that has garnered international attention for many reasons. But of course, for us here in Australia, it's dominated headlines as well, because we've seen these journalists on the ground in LA reporting for Australian broadcasters. So Lauren Tomasi from Channel 9, Lauren Day, a correspondent for the ABC. both of those journalists have reported being targeted, injured by police. We saw the rubber bullet that was fired at the Channel 9 reporter. The ABC journo was caught up in tear gas that police dispersed across a crowd. An ABC cameraman was shot in the chest with a rubber bullet. And that's just what we've heard from the Aussies on the ground. There are reporters out of the UK and the US who have cited similar run-ins with police.
And just on that, we do know that the LAPD is currently investigating how that Channel 9 journalist was shot at.
Yeah.
Because the vision does show that it was an officer who did point the gun at her. So an investigation is underway into what happened there.
Exactly. And that incident has been criticised and condemned by the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister Penny Wong. But clearly this is just another element of a very escalating and evolving story. But in terms of global interest, in terms of national interest here in Australia, you know, it's not going away.
Right.
I'm sure there'll be more to talk about in the days to come. And as always, we'll keep you updated. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. We will be back a little later on in the day with the evening news headlines. But until then, have a fantastic day.